What's up, Samurai? We are back as more Trove, continuing the 45k series with the Chloromancer, who has definitely had its time in the sun. Get it? Because it's a plant. It used to be the biggest boss killer in the game. It is still good at killing bosses, but as you'll see in today's video, it does suffer from a lack of movement speed. And generally speaking, there are stronger boss killers, Solarian, than the Chloromancer at this point. Now, that said, thanks to the skill tree, we do have 135 movement speed at our base value, which is very, very nice. So yeah, I don't know why 2 seconds ago I had 35 flasks and now it just got back down to 30. Weird. But I'm going to use a Solarian subclass ability just because it's going to end up giving me the extra light value, and I probably should show you guys skill tree stuff in these 45k videos, but frankly speaking, I got other videos that talk about the skill tree. We have the life leech, which is going to end up being a big deal, and we also have all of the star chart allies, so this is probably going to be the best bet for the Chloromancer, just because the cooldown reduction, even though cooldown reduction is not as big of a deal on this guy anymore, but anyways, Chloromancer back in the day, I mained this character, even though I didn't find its capabilities to be that good, just because the lashers themselves would basically only, well, they would only be able to deal damage to one enemy, even if there was multiple of them on the ground, but now that's actually changed. The trick with the Chloromancer back in the day, when it was a boss killer though, after its rework, was that you could throw down a bunch of plants, but they could only throw down a limited amount within a small vicinity of one another. So what players would essentially do, which as far as I know has been patched, you would throw down things like this, and then if they were like 8 blocks apart, you could go over the cap, right? So it would just be like crazy chongo damage on bosses, and it would just stack and stack and stack. Anyways, that's irrelevant now, because as far as I recall, that's been patched. The hidden ring effect that you're going to be aiming for on this character is going to end up being either weird growth or Gatling, mostly Gatling, but weird growth is going to be after dealing damage, gain a buff that spawns plants randomly nearby for a short time. That would be okay if the internal cooldown wasn't so bad, but Gatling makes it so that base attacks have a chance to spawn a mini Gatling, and mini green Gatlings have a chance to spawn mini green Gatlings. So that could end up doing heaps and heaps of damage if you end up having that actually cause a beautiful chain reaction, but more likely it's not going to. I've got nothing but movement speed on all of my gear and attack speed because that's basically how you build this character, except for my hat doesn't have attack speed. Weird. It shouldn't matter too much, honestly speaking. But anyways, we're gonna do 5 minutes of the smallest Sundered Uplands biome ever. Let me go and get to the Sundered Uplands over here. All right, there we go. So another thing too I want to mention, I forgot to mention this in my Bard 45k video, but I did mention it in my Flask guide. I know I shouldn't be using Death Defying, okay? I'm just using it because I'm lazy. So anyways, as far as damage is concerned, you see, we've got a decent amount of damage with our base attack, but most of all, we're just gonna be throwing down our plants. Unfortunately, this is kind of what happens with Chloromancer. This is why boss killing is going to be more ideal, just because the enemies will slowly move around and our plants don't follow them. They kind of just stay static. So you gotta get really lucky or just have a bunch of melee enemies. But as you saw, you know, we've got definitely, you know, we definitely got the damage. We just have to make sure that we're doing a constant stream of plants and are very careful not to throw down. Hello? Not to miss throwing down another one. Why does this game refuse to cooperate, like, at all when I'm doing these 45k videos? Like, I hate this video game. Anyways, I guess it'll be a prime example to show you guys that, unfortunately, oh, let me use Trailblazing. Unfortunately, Chloromancer is severely lacking the movement speed to make it an actual speed farmer. We do have the damage, which, you know, if we need to pop our ult, okay, sure. But that was a big chunk amount of damage, as you saw, which is beautiful and is why, even though people are underestimating this character, I personally would say that it still is good as a boss killer. But it's just not going to be a class that you should main for every aspect of the game, namely when you are trying to deal with speed farming, because sometimes this happens. This is a very realistic scenario in Trove where there just aren't any dungeons nearby. And unfortunately, that means that you gotta speed over to the next dungeon. But Chloromancer is one of the few characters that doesn't actually have any movement speed abilities, and so you kind of suffer in that regard. You know, you don't end up having like Shadowhunter's movement speed ability and Neo Ninja, and you know, most classes end up having a nice fancy buff nowadays to end up giving them movement speed. And unfortunately, Chloro is severely lacking in that regard. And so, I mean, it also doesn't help that this is the worst generation I've ever seen. Like, seriously, it just doesn't want to cooperate. But what's the more important thing? Well, you guys are looking at damage, in which case, look at the sheer amount of damage that we end up doing when our plants end up spawning. The problem is that the time to kill is a little bit lacking with the Chloromancer as well, just because other classes will deal equal amounts of damage with a shorter amount of time. So what I would mostly argue when talking about speed farming is it comes in two categories. So there's going to end up being how fast you can get to the next dungeon and how fast you can kill what is in that dungeon. Those two factors come into play with the fastest classes in the game because they have a good time to kill, Shadowhunter, and a good movement speed, Neo Ninja. Now, with Chloromancer, unfortunately, you can see we do have the damage, but unfortunately it is 100% reliant on our plants, and our Gatling plant is very, very stupid. So there's not really any AI in this game, and unfortunately for us, that means that our Gatling plant will actually shoot once and ask questions later. It basically, we have to get lucky enough to have whatever enemy we're facing stay in place so that our turret actually shoots at them without missing. And you can see it does lots and lots of damage when it does attack, but you gotta get lucky enough to actually have the plant shoot at the enemy stay perfectly still and not move so that we can actually end up hitting the enemy, because that's kind of one of the big, another problem with the character in terms of speed farming is if you have a ranged enemy, their AI, if you want to call it that, I would call it not even a brain, is that they will slightly veer to the left or right and circle around your turrets, and then it doesn't end up doing any damage. Now, we can always end up popping our ult if we want to do Mongo Chongo damage. I saw 74 mil damage right there. But again, as far as my own feedback to the character, I'd say you're not going to be using this character for speed farming. And because of those little oversights from the developers about the class and its abilities and stuff, unfortunately, it does mean that we do suffer when we are fighting Delves enemies as well. I'm not going to say that we can't handle Delves, because we can. Chloromancer obviously has the damage. But unfortunately, unless we have the vacuum, thank God we do, we don't really have a method of keeping enemies nice up close and personal while we're trying to actually deal the damage. And again, you can see we've got the damage. It just requires a little bit of time before it ends up activating. And sometimes you'll end up having these enemies spawn a little further away from us, and then there's not really much we can do about that. But I mean, we're also just getting the worst generation I've ever seen. Like, this is probably the worst generation I've ever seen in a 45K video. But I mean, obviously, as a class at 45K, we are going to deal heaps of damage anyways. It doesn't really matter whether we're using Chloromancer or not. And so the question always remains, well, how's the damage going to be in comparison to another class? And again, I would say that the Chloromancer has a lot more damage than most people give credit for it. The reason why most people moved on from the Chloromancer and you don't really see Chloro mains anymore is just because the recent nerfs to the character, or they're not really recent, it was last year, but they ended up nerfing the character so it doesn't handle bosses as well as it used to, which I find very strange, because basically they ended up nerfing the heck out of the Chloromancer, kind of breaking it in a way. And yet they ended up adding a character as powerful in God tier as the Solarian, which it's just a very questionable decision to me, because the Chloromancer, I feel, would have fit in very well with the power creep that we ended up getting with Solarian. Like, a lot of the classes in the game kind of ended up slowly getting buffed, and Chloromancer was not one of them. But Chloromancer, when it got its original rework, obviously, you know, that was really, really good for its damage, albeit, I will admit, I'm not the biggest fan of the Chloromancer rework. I don't know, there's something about the gameplay with the Chloromancer now that I'm just not as into, you know? But anyways, now we're at the boss, so I gotta make darn sure that I spawn all of the right plants by using the right ultimate. And I also am not doing this boss correctly because I didn't end up using my cooldown emblems, so unfortunately my damage is a little bit scuffed. But keep in mind that I would just be able to spam my plants even more, and that guy probably would have died twice as quick. So, you know, in conclusion, can you end up maining the Chloromancer? Yeah, you can for delves, and more particularly for bosses. You can still solo Leviathans with the Chloromancer. I mean, what class can't solo Leviathans nowadays? But that, I feel, is going to end up changing whenever they end up deciding to add their difficulty update, which we're just kind of speculating and guessing about it. Just there's a lot of things that imply that they're working on another difficulty, which I hope isn't just U12. But either way, Chloromancer is a character that you can definitely main. If you are specifically doing dungeons, though, and that's like your primary source of gameplay with Trove, then I wouldn't really recommend it. You can use the Chloromancer for early game and mid game for dungeons, but as soon as you end up getting into that end game high movement speed tier of gameplay, then Chloromancer is just really, really slow. But as far as style is concerned, 10 out of 10. Thanks for watching. Smash the like, sub for more. Buy the merch you want to support the channel, and have a wonderful day, everybody.